Welcome back, everyone. Our next panel will discuss NATO and the future of deterrence. Our first panelist is NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning, Angus Lapsley. Joining him will be Justyna Gotkowska, Dr. Heather Williams, and Professor Stephen Flanagan, who will be moderating. Angus Lapsley has served as the NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning since September of 2022. Within NATO's international staff, Mr. Lapsley leads the team responsible for the alliance's capability and force planning, posture plans, and a range of defense policy questions, including nuclear issues. Prior to his appointment, Assistant Secretary General Lapsley spent over 30 years as a diplomat for the United Kingdom. Justyna Gotkowska is the Deputy Director at the Warsaw-based Center for Eastern Studies, also known as OSW, and head of the Security and Defense Department. She focuses on regional and European security and defense issues in Northern and Central Europe, and has also written about NATO's defense and deterrence posture on the eastern flank. Dr. Heather Williams is the Director of the Project on Nuclear Issues and a Senior Fellow in the International Security Program at CSIS. She is also an Associate Fellow with the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School and was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow in the Security Studies program at MIT. Dr. Williams has extensive experience as a professor and lecturer on arms control, deterrence, and disarmament at King's College London, and previously served as a specialist advisor to the House of Lords International Relations Committee inquiry into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and disarmament. Finally, Professor Stephen Flanagan is an adjunct senior fellow at RAND and adjunct professor of security studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. Flanagan has served in several senior positions in the U.S. government, including Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Defense Policy and Strategy, and previously for the President and Senior Director for Central and Eastern Europe at the National Security Council staff. Flanagan has published numerous books, reports, journal articles, and commentaries on transatlantic, international security, and defense issues. Please join me in welcoming the panelists to the stage.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here and having a chance with this panel to delve into a bit further into some of the issues that have already been explored a little bit in the first panel, but now we're going to dig down a bit more into this question of the future capacity for deterrence and defense. I'll make a few opening remarks to set the stage a bit in the transition between the first and second panel, and then turn to each of our distinguished panelists for a series of questions following in the pattern of the first panel. So, building consensus on the appropriate size and mix of conventional and nuclear capabilities, as well as on the strategy for their employment and equitable sharing of the fiscal burdens and strategic risks of maintaining them, has been an enduring challenge in the realization of NATO's deterrence and defense policy over the past 7 decades. And you heard already from our first panelists about some of these enduring tensions. It became clear in NATO's earliest days that the ambitious conventional force goals that allies set at an extraordinary 1952 meeting, Lisbon, of the foreign, defense, and finance ministers to counter the Soviet threat. It's almost unimaginable, 50 divisions, 4,000 aircraft, 700 ships, that certainly was never going to be achieved, at least not within the realm of fiscal realities at that time. So NATO soon shifted to a greater reliance on the nuclear dimension of deterrence, particularly U.S. strategic forces, and then moving from the concept of massive retaliation in the 1950s to flexible response in the 1960s, which envisioned a more sustained initial defense with conventional forces while preserving ambiguity about how nuclear weapons might be employed. We also heard in the first panel that, of course, strong opposition in many allied countries to the 1979 dual-track decision on deploying intermediate-range nuclear weapons in Europe to counter new Soviet capabilities and strengthen the linkage to the U.S. strategic deterrent led to redoubled efforts to improve conventional capabilities. NATO launched what was then known as the Long-Term Defense Program of 1979 to 86 to mitigate negative shifts in the military balance with the Soviet Union by exploiting new operational concepts and emerging technologies. Well, few allies met the goal of 3% real growth in annual defense spending to realize that program. Deterrence held, and NATO continued to rely heavily on the nuclear dimension of deterrence. After the Cold War, the deterrence and defense of alliance territory became less urgent, and of course the focus, as you heard Ambassador Smith earlier and some of the earlier panel, the focus of Allied military efforts shifted to the conduct of expeditionary peacekeeping, stabilization, and later counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan. Now, of course, in the wake of Russia's annexation of Crimea and the instigation of the insurgency in the Donbass in 2014, NATO undertook steps to reassure multiple vulnerable allies and bolster deterrence by developing the enhanced forward presence in northeastern Europe and the tailored forward presence in southeastern Europe. Since 2022, NATO has taken further steps to strengthen this forward presence in the eastern part of the alliance and other elements of its defense strategy and military posture, and added 2 new members, as we heard Ambassador Smith mention today earlier. Allies are also reviving national resilience plans, seeking ways to augment defense industrial capacity and expanding cooperation in both those areas. In this session, we have asked our panelists to discuss the state of all those efforts and the next steps to advance and sustain what NATO calls its concept of deterrence and defense. We are very fortunate to have 3 speakers who can address these issues authoritatively, and I will turn to them in sequence and then in each of their areas of expertise and responsibility. So let me start first with Assistant Secretary General Lapsley. Would you provide the audience a bit of an overview of the developments in the Alliance's deterrence and defense concept and military posture in recent years, particularly decisions taken since 2022 to reinforce and expand the number of battle groups in the eastern flank, and progress in advancing both the decisions of the Madrid and Vilnius NATO summits that tried to add to additional elements to support the deterrence and defense concept.
Well, thanks, Steve, and morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here in this splendid setting. And I think you're right in your question that something quite profound is happening in NATO at the moment, and has been now for a couple of years, which is an alliance that for most of the post-Cold War period was focused on building regional security and expeditionary operations, is now right back to putting deterrence and defense at the heart of our agenda. And that was confirmed by the Madrid summit and then the Vilnius summit. I'd say 2 points about our kind of overall approach. The first is there's a reason why we talk about deterrence and defense in that order, because the primary goal of the alliance is to make sure there isn't an attack on any NATO ally. And we've been pretty successful at that for the last 75 years. But I think there is a recognition amongst allies at the moment that the scale of the challenge, in particular from Russia, Russian risk-taking, Russian capabilities, Russian political objectives, mean that we absolutely cannot take our success in that for granted. Of course, the best way to achieve deterrence is to convince your adversary that if we had to fight, we would do so successfully and we would win. And putting that mentality back at the heart of NATO is really what is happening at the moment. I think the second point I'd make about deterrence, and it will link to some of the things I think probably Heather will say, is we're really conscious that we have to think of it in sort of layers. So we have to manage, and if we can, deter all of the ways in which Russia is trying to divide us and harm us that stop short of open war, what we call sub-threshold threats, action in space, cyberspace, interfering in our politics, disinformation, etc. Then we have to be ready to deter in the conventional sense of being able to stop and win a conventional attack on NATO. And then lastly, we have to be ready to maintain deterrence when it comes to nuclear weapons and other forms of strategic effect against us. And how those three layers interact is actually really complicated and one of the most interesting things in the alliance at the moment. We use the word coherence. Sometimes people use the word integration. But it's about convincing the other side that there's no gap, there's no space that you can come at us at, that you can exploit. I think in terms of how we're doing, though, Stephen, to your question. So the first thing that's happening is a lot of reorganization of the alliance, but more profoundly of national defenses, in particular in Europe. So we now have a set of plans, war plans and strategic plans that tell us how we will manage deterrence and how we would, if we moved into crisis or open conflict, how we would fight. And those plans are critical. You'll hear from General Cavoli this afternoon, who owns those plans, who drew them up. Because if you follow through the logic of those plans, they tell each national defense force what they're going to be doing, where they're going to be doing it, how they're going to be doing it, who they're going to be doing it with. And that is quite transformative. We haven't had that in the alliance since the end of the Cold War. With the plans come the need to reform our command and control systems. And there is a lot happening there in terms of the reorganization of headquarters, allocations of specific roles to specific headquarters, growing some headquarters, like, for example, the one in Norfolk, Virginia, which is responsible for the Atlantic and Northern Europe. And it comes with a capability demand signal. It comes with a bill. And this is the core of my job. And because we now know what the plans are, what you'd need to fight them, and because allies have become much more transparent with us over the last 2 years about what they've got and what their plans are, I now have a pretty good idea of where the gaps are and therefore what we need to press allies to invest in over the next couple of years. And there are areas like we know we're going to need a lot more air and missile defense. We know we're going to need more deep fires to hold targets at risk at long range. We know we need a lot more logistics and enablement capabilities, the ability to move things around, sustain them and supply them. We need better digital underpinning of our force so that we can actually fight in a multi-domain way. And then we still need the ability to bring our land forces together and coalesce them as larger formations, divisions and corps, and fight them coherently. So we've got a pretty big capability challenge ahead of us. The good news is there is now, I think, a recognition in Europe that to meet those capability targets, we are going to need to invest more. And as Ambassador Smith said this morning, things are changing there. We've gone from having half a dozen allies in Europe spending 2% of GDP on defense to having over 20, and I'm hoping the numbers will keep rising. Even today, I think there's an announcement coming out in Canada about increased defense spending. So, and you have a lot of, in particular, wealthy Northern European allies who were not spending that much on defense over the last two decades, now really starting to invest. Now, all of that will take time to have effect. You also need to find the people to then actually fill out your armed forces, and you need the industrial capacity to get there. But I'm kind of quite optimistic that Europeans are now moving in a much stronger direction. The last point I just make is I think sometimes people underestimate that there is a cultural and intellectual reset of the alliance that is as important as the organizational structures and the money and the industrial capacity and the people. Actually getting people to understand what deterrence means in the modern world and what defense would mean in the modern world, what it would mean for our whole societies if we were under attack, not just frontline countries who would obviously feel it most, but also rear area countries, if you like, who would almost certainly face massive cyber attacks, possibly air attacks, disruption to their space-based capabilities, etc. So it is, I think, it's a really exciting time to be in the alliance and to be working at NATO because people understand the scale of the challenge and national governments are, I think, really starting to get to grips with what it means.
Great, thank you very much. Really opening up the doors to a number of areas, and we want to come back to that question of resilience. But that's also a good segue to what I wanted to ask Justyna Gotkowska. Given where you work and live on the eastern flank, would you share insights from your work at the Center for Eastern Studies and thinking of Central East European governments about NATO's current forward defense posture and the requirements of deterrence by denial and defense, as allies have professed very strongly in the last several years, of every inch of alliance territory?
Sure. Thank you for this question. Thank you for the opportunity to share my ideas and views from Poland. I would start with saying that NATO's conventional deterrence and defense posture has more elements that enhance forward presence or forward defense, as you said, and it's I would go back in time and tell you how this enhanced forward presence was perceived on the eastern flank. It all started, of course, after 2014 annexation of Crimea and Russian intervention in Donbas, and there was the first strengthening of deterrence and defense on the eastern flank. It took quite a long time since 2014 because the decision was made 2016. The first battle groups came 2017, 4 battle groups in 3 Baltic states and Poland. And back then it was the main and the only, actually, substantial NATO military presence on the eastern flank. So that was some kind of a breakthrough. But at the same time, each of the 4 NATO battle groups amounted to little more than 1,000 troops. So overall, this NATO presence was, and I think still is, too small to ensure the defense of the Baltic states and Poland. It was intended more as a part of the tripwire strategy that would trigger an allied military response. And that was an outcome of a compromise among NATO member states after 2014, when some of them still wanted to stick to the NATO-Russia Founding Act that set limitations on stationing substantial forces in the new, back then, 1997, new member states of the alliance. But it was not the only NATO response, and I want to underline that because it's important when we talk about conventional deterrence and defense now. Back then, NATO decided on a reform of NATO response force, on reform of force and command structures. So there were division-level commands, headquarters created in Poland, Latvia. There was 2 headquarters created on the strategic level, Joint Force Command Norfolk and Joint Support and Enabling Command in Ulm. And all this presence, it's worth to underline, was supplemented by placing a US ABCT Armored Brigade Combat Team in Poland, 5,000 soldiers. And this presence was reformed and refurbished after 2022 Russian invasion full-scale invasion on Ukraine, with 4 more battle groups being established, with a decision to increase battle groups in Lithuania and in Latvia to a brigade. So then NATO-Russia Founding Act was deemed as non-binding in the conventional realm. And then first NATO exercises came, which exercised reinforcing these battle groups to a brigade level. Very important changes, but still not sufficient to call it a forward defense or defense by denial, in the opinion of many in the Baltic state and in Poland. But to that, some qualitative changes were added that Angus was talking about. Reintroduction of a detailed defense planning with 3 new regional defense plans, a setup of a NATO force model that was mentioned already in the former panel, and as well as Sweden and Finland joining NATO. This strategically changes the landscape in the Baltic Sea region. So very important changes, and as adding to that, another 5,000 US soldier being placed in Poland and exercising across the northeastern flank. In this setup, is the NATO enhanced forward presence on the eastern flank a forward defense or defense by denial? I would say I have doubts, not yet. Maybe we are heading towards this goal, but I think allies need to invest in capabilities, in readiness, and in placing additional assets in the Baltic states, Poland, and elsewhere on the eastern flank. But it does not mean that deterrent does not work. It does. And I think this is a conviction on the eastern flank and in Poland, because behind the battle groups, this enhanced forward presence on the eastern flank, we have a transatlantic alliance that is politically coherent and that is signaling the will to use whole military potential to defend its allies if needed. There is the US military capabilities, European allies that are in the progress of rebuilding their capabilities, and last but not least, national capabilities and investment in national armed forces in Poland, in the Baltic states, and elsewhere on the eastern flank. So such calibrated conventional deterrence depends on very much on many elements, and if some fall, if some fall out or will be diminished, others must step in or deterrence will fail. So the main question on the eastern flank is not about the current posture, but about the future of the deterrence, that it depends highly on the future of US policy towards Europe, having in mind US domestic developments, that depends on potential conflicts in the Indo-Pacific and its consequences for Europe and for the eastern flank, that depends on the pace of national and European investments in defense, and depends on the states of transatlantic relations. So, but all in all, having in mind the anticipation of politically very volatile times also within the alliance, a strong allied military presence on the eastern flank is necessary in order to deter Russia from undertaking risky adventures, like, for example, and I think this is what we are worrying mostly about, in the coming years, like starting a conventional limited aggression on the Baltic states because there is not enough forces for defense by denial, with a threat of use of nuclear weapons. So in order to divide the alliance, in order to for the allies not to respond, hesitating to go into nuclear escalation. So therefore, we do need to work on, even if the conventional deterrence and defense has more elements, I think working and making progress and strengthening enhanced forward presence to make it for defense is necessary as perceived on the eastern flank.
Great, thank you very much, Justyna. I would like to come back maybe to some of the questions where we talk with also Angus about the force model and the force generation capabilities, but you led very nicely into another question that, and you're talking about, of course, the fact that the conventional deterrent posture is backed up by the U.S. strategic guarantee and the nuclear capabilities of those two other allies that have those nuclear capabilities. So I wanted to turn to Heather Williams and ask her, how do you assess the state and general direction of the nuclear dimension of the alliance's deterrent posture, including the steps that have been taken or should be taken to ensure that NATO's non-strategic nuclear deterrent capabilities remain safe, secure, and effective, steps that have been taken over the last several years?
Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you to Georgetown for the invitation. I'm really honored to be on this panel. I wanted to start off by zooming out just a little bit to point out a couple of the fundamentals of NATO's nuclear posture, because I think that those will shape the direction it goes forward in. So first and foremost, NATO has said as long as nuclear weapons exist, it will remain a nuclear alliance. Additionally, I think it's worth pointing out those nuclear capabilities, the dual capable aircraft mission, any nuclear sharing arrangements, those have been getting a lot of attention lately, but really what underpins NATO's nuclear posture are the nuclear forces of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, particularly the United States. And then the other kind of, I think, decisive factor in the direction that we're going to go in is NATO has also consistently said that they remain committed to arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. And so those are three seemingly competing priorities in some ways that are going to have to work together to shape the direction that the alliance goes in. And so with that in mind, there's a couple indicators we're already getting about the direction that NATO is going in on these issues. As been mentioned a few times, there has clearly been an effort by the allies to strengthen the quote-unquote deterrence IQ. I should say I don't like this term. I find it slightly pejorative, but if the allies are fine with it, fine. But really, it's about relearning deterrence issues. And I particularly commend the new allies, Finland and Sweden, for the efforts that they have been putting into better understanding what does it mean to be part of a nuclear alliance? What is nuclear deterrence really about? What is extended nuclear deterrence about? The other direction of travel that I think we're seeing is this really impressive unity around NATO's nuclear mission. If you had asked me in January of 2022, is Germany more likely to double its defense budget or to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, I would have lost a lot of money. And so this unity that we're seeing around the nuclear mission is a really important trend that I don't think we should take for granted. From my perspective, there are two big factors that I think are going to shape the direction that it goes in. The first, obviously, is Russia, but it's particularly the question of how much is Russia going to rely on nuclear weapons going forward. As we have seen, Russia's conventional forces have not performed particularly well, and they've had to resort to buying some pretty, crappy systems off of others. But it isn't just about Russia's conventional performance, it's about the investment that Russia is going to have to put in to rebuild its conventional forces. That is not a quick turnaround process. And while they're doing that, I would anticipate that that they will shift to greater reliance on nuclear weapons. This happened in the 90s as well, obviously. But also, I would anticipate Russia continues its nuclear saber rattling. That saber rattling has underpinned it since day one of the invasion. It has taken different sounds, it has looked a bit different, but it has been consistent. Disinformation has been a really key part of that. I was glad that came up so much in the previous panel. But the second trend that I think is going to be really important here, it is going to be the impact of two-peer competition, this thing that all of us wonks in DC are really obsessed with and talking about and focused on right now. From my conversations with the allies, and every time I see Angus, I think I ask him this question: how are the allies thinking about two-peer competition? I think that thinking it seems like that thinking has started. It's still evolving a bit, but the way that the allies engage with that issue will have a really significant impact on the alliance's nuclear posture and the dimension there. For example, if the U.S. is if U.S. conventional forces are diverted to a different theater, what does that mean for the allies? Are they going to have to step up and contribute more conventionally? And so I think the direction of travel really is flexibility. That seems to be what NATO wants more of in its nuclear posture. And there's a couple options that I'm hearing about that I think could contribute to that. To be clear, I don't agree with all these. I'm just putting them out there to keep it spicy. The first one would be supplemental or new nuclear capabilities on the part of the United States. So the most obvious one here is SLCM-N, Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, nuclear variant, or other regional capabilities. Another option would be to look to another important nuclear actor in NATO, which is the UK. For example, if the UK wanted to add a fifth boat, or add another leg back to its nuclear delivery platforms. I think there are some pretty serious domestic and financial constraints on that, but that's another option. Another one, which I'm sure we'll get to, would be to expand the nuclear sharing mission within Europe. Poland has obviously indicated interest in that. But then another option might be a change in nuclear posture and strategy. For example, to consider earlier and more decisive escalation, either with advanced conventional weapons or with nuclear weapons. This last point is one I think is really interesting in the context of two-peer competition in particular, because the United States, at least, we're no longer just signaling to one adversary. If we end up in a crisis, we're now signaling to two. And so that's where I think kind of more decisive earlier action could be justified. To your other question, what should be done to remain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal? Well, as I said, NATO's nuclear posture is underpinned by 3 nuclear possessors, particularly the United States. If you want a safe, secure, and effective NATO nuclear posture, you need a safe, secure, and effective U.S. nuclear arsenal. And so at the very least, the U.S. has to continue on its current modernization plans. There have been plenty of challenges with that. We all know Sentinel is in a difficult growing period, we'll say. It has to do with Nunn-McCurdy now as well. But so really proceeding apace with U.S. modernization and the current program of record at a minimum, I think is essential for NATO's nuclear security. But in addition to that, there's things that other allies can be doing, participating in nuclear exercising, the alliance continuously evaluating its forces in response to all these changes, and these are things that the alliance really is doing anyways, and so I commend that. I know this panel is about deterrence, but I also wanted to bring up assurance, which I think is a really key component of this conversation. Because as I'm talking more and more, as I talk to European allies, I'm hearing them more and more express their concerns about US credibility. And domestic politics is absolutely a part of that. The other part of that is that it seems like quite a few allies are concerned that at what they perceive as competing priorities for US attention, particularly in the Middle East and China. To quote a Polish expert who I met with in Warsaw a few months ago, said, we are now number 3 on your list of foreign policy priorities, and it's probably a distant third as well, coming after the war in Gaza and obviously China. And so for that, I want to make a slightly more impassioned recommendation here to my fellow Americans, which is that in addition to following through with our nuclear modernization plan, I wouldn't dare to hope that we get on the same page domestically about allies, but I would hope that we would have enough courage in our convictions to have the debate about making the case for why allies are one of our greatest strategic assets and why maintaining transatlantic leadership remains in America's national interest. And I haven't heard that debate yet, and so I hope that we can get to that.
No, thank you very much. No, and I would like to come back to that question of the peer-to-peer deterrence and what impact that might have on the U.S. extended deterrent, the credibility of that. So you've raised a couple of other good issues that we should definitely come back to. But I did want to turn back a little bit to the initial capabilities for defense and back to Angus on, we did talk, and Justyna mentioned, the discussion of the NATO force model, which has very ambitious and much larger force generation goals and very rapid. SACEUR has also been working on these plans, and I wondered if you could give us some sense, obviously some of that can't be discussed in much detail, but whether there might be some additional elements of that or perhaps reinforced by the decisions of the Washington summit on both the plans and the development of the force generation capabilities.
Yeah, well, I think this slightly goes to Justyna's commentary on how do Eastern flank countries feel about the posture we have now and whether that is sufficiently robust enough. And I mean, I think the honest answer is if the only way we were going to defend the eastern flank was through the battle groups, even when scaled up to brigade level, the answer would be no. But of course, that's not the only way that we plan to defend all of the territory of the alliance. One of the things which obviously Ukraine can't draw on, but that we would, is the enormous amount of air power and power that can be projected from the sea. Whenever I'm in the Baltic states, I remind them that you do realize an awful lot of the firepower that would defend your country will come from the North Atlantic or the Norwegian Sea, for example. But also, we're very focused on this question of actually how do you move the forces that you need into place at the right time. And that comes down to two things. First of all, it comes down, well, actually three. First of all, you have to have the right warnings and indicators. You need to know what's happening. And of course, if you go back to the invasion of Ukraine at the beginning of 2022, actually we saw it all. We had a big debate about what it meant, but we saw it all. Even the Russians can't actually assemble an invasion force invisibly. So first of all, you need to see what's happening. Secondly, you need to act early enough, in particular, to move forces. And we are taking decisions in the alliance now about giving SACEUR the necessary authorities to make muscle moves and move forces into place before you get to an Article 5 situation. And then thirdly, you need, as I said, the kind of capabilities, the logistics to move stuff, and you need the military mobility set up so that you know how you move across Europe at scale. So there's a lot in that kind of mix. On the force model particularly, so essentially what NATO allies, European allies in particular, have been doing for the last 20 years is they've been providing relatively small forces, sending them to the other side of the world or somewhere else, and doing that on a rotational basis. An Article 5 situation is very different. In an Article 5 situation, you need a much larger force, but you pretty much know where it's going and what its job is going to do, what it's going to be. So the way in which we organize our forces has really changed. Last year at the summit in Vilnius, we confirmed that we had about 300,000 forces, troops at high readiness. The number of forces that lie behind that at lower degrees of readiness is much, much larger than that. And actually, one of the really encouraging things of the last 12 months is that most European allies have come to us and come to SACEUR and said, in an Article 5 situation, if we've got it, you've got it. Pretty much our entire force structures will be made available to NATO to fight the fight. And we know, as I said earlier, there are lots of capability gaps then within that force structure, and our job is to make sure that allies fill those gaps over the next few years. But we have a much clearer idea now of how we will fight and where we'll do it.
Great, thank you. And yes, military mobility, but that also is a good segue to what I wanted to ask Justyna a little bit about, and there was discussion, Heidi Hart, in the first panel about NATO's been very good about learning lessons. I wanted to ask about what you think of some of the key lessons from Russia's war on Ukraine for NATO strategy and posture, and how those could be applied in enhancing the security of NATO and Ukraine, which is, I would note, the mission of this new center that NATO defense ministers just agreed to establish in Poland on the NATO-Ukraine cooperation on joint training, education, and lessons learned.
Definitely, NATO has a lot to learn from Ukraine, both from Ukraine's adaptability to what is happening on the battlefield, on the way, from the way how Russia is waging this war and what Russia is learning from the war fighting. But overall, I would like to make a comment that the war in Ukraine will probably be not repeated in that form if we had a conflict between Russia and NATO because of what Angus just said, allied air power, long-range strikes, intelligence and reconnaissance. That would change substantially the picture of how this war, a conflict between Russia and NATO would be waged from the first days. These capabilities, something that Ukraine did not have from the start of this war, or not in in some parts not in that magnitude, and currently has only a limited access to. As I mentioned, we need also to look at lessons learned that Russia takes from this war, from the use of Western-made weapon systems. My observation as a civilian, not military, what NATO should learn and what Poland is learning from this war is that we need more mass. We talked about that in the previous panel. The magnitude of the conflict war in Ukraine shows that European armed forces need to grow to build bigger reserves. We have a discussion in Europe on the eastern flank ongoing, or decision made already, on reintroduction of compulsory draft, extending the voluntary one in case of the Nordic states, drafting women, or on introducing a kind of state service that would be an alternative to military draft for young people to serve in civilian crisis response formations. So this is a discussion that we have in Poland. We have abolished the draft 2011, and right now we have a public discussions that is not yet taken seriously by the politicians and military, but some decisions were made on creating bigger reserves. More air defense, more mass, more heavy land formations. I think if you look at Poland's decision on military procurement, that shows that Poland's lesson was to strengthen land forces, heavy armored capabilities. And the war in Ukraine, even if it will not be repeated as it is being waged right now, shows to us that NATO needs to reinvest in the military capabilities it thought that some years ago that are gone. And another issue is we need to exercise in bigger formations. I think this is a point that we see in the training of Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian soldiers in Europe, a point that is missing and that has an effect, negative effect on their performance on the battlefield in Ukraine. Third point, more air defense. I think observing Ukrainian air defenses, we need to know that Ukraine has had huge amounts of post-Soviet equipment that helped it to defend Ukraine cities. Later on, this post-Soviet equipment was replaced or supplemented by Western air defense systems, but we don't have it in NATO. There is a huge gap to be dealt with by all member states, NATO northeastern flank states included. We have right now problems in Poland where you might have heard about that, where we have Russian missiles flying through Polish airspace, taking a turn for a second time, and attacking Ukrainian territory with, in my opinion and in the opinion of many Poles, Russia deliberately testing our reactions where we don't have capabilities to put nationally and limited capabilities within NATO. We don't have ground-based systems to put them on the Polish-Ukrainian border to deter Russia from such moves or to shoot down such missiles with ground-based air defense systems. That shows how huge this gap is and how quickly we need to invest in it. Poland is doing that, but it takes time. Is working with the US on mid-range air defense, Patriot with the UK on lower levels. So the only way to counter such Russian moves is to use fighter jets and try to shoot down, in the future, Russian missiles from the air. More long-range strike capabilities. This is my fourth point. We have seen the discussions and leaked conversations from Germany, from the top military representatives of the Bundeswehr, talking about Scalp and Storm French and UK long-range missiles being depleted, and therefore the need for delivering towers. So definitely there is a need to invest in our long-range strike capabilities and to increase the stocks. More ammunition, this is obvious, natural, we have been talking about that. But what is particularly interesting from the war in Ukraine and from the Ukrainian adaptability is introducing innovation to the battleground, how to do that quickly, how to change the mode of operation of arms industry. This is not accustomed to such a pace of development and change, and I think Ukrainian can teach us here some lessons. I have a few points, but I will end with an issue of civilian resilience. That is particularly important to us on the northeastern flank, how to prepare society to function in crisis and conflict situation, hugely important to learn lessons from Ukraine, and how to move, for example, major public services online, something that Ukraine has done under the war conditions. Poland is very advanced in that, and I think Ukraine can teach us a lot of. We can learn a lot from Ukraine. Also, civil-military cooperation, that would be another point.
Well, thank you.
I'll stay.
Oh, great, thank you. And I do want to come back to the nuclear question, but before we do, since you mentioned resilience, I know that Angus has been working on, and his colleagues at NATO headquarters have been working on looking at ways to encourage cooperation among allies and strengthening their national resilience, defense, industrial capability. If you might touch on that as just briefly before we go to and then I'll come back to Heather and we'll go to some questions from the audience.
Sure. Well, Justyna introduced it really well. I think there are two kind of big aspects to this. So the first is, are societies and civilian governments, are they thinking about and do they have plans for how they would experience a war, essentially? And this is partly a psychological shift, and you've seen some allies actually addressing their populations very directly about this. Countries like Sweden and Denmark have sort of stood up very boldly recently and said to their populations, you need to be ready for the prospect of war. But it's also about, are you planning to, how you would keep going things like provision of energy, food, telecommunications, healthcare, transport, etc. So what we do in NATO is we set benchmarks for what does good look like in each of these areas, and we now have a process of assessing allies against that, helping them to learn from each other, do sort of compare and contrast. The other aspect to this is the relationship between the military and the civilians in a war. So many civilian governments over the last 20, 30 years have got quite used to the idea that if there is a civilian contingency, you turn to the military for help with a pandemic or a natural disaster or a terrorist attack. In a full-scale Article 5 situation, actually that dynamic is likely to get reversed because the military will be flat out dealing with the military threat. What it will need from the civilian side is access to transport, access to much larger healthcare, much less dealing with mass casualties, for example, probably access to stocks of food and energy and things like that that it wouldn't be able to generate organically. So this is why one of the things we're looking at for the Washington summit is allies making a pledge that they will all have nationally, each according to their own systems, a mechanism for doing that civ-mil, as we call it, civilian military planning, so that they know they are ready for that. There is a third aspect to resilience, which is as well making sure that our own infrastructure is not vulnerable to interference from hostile powers. And that's obviously a lot about Russia, but it's also a lot about China. And when you look at how embedded China has become in a lot of infrastructure and sensitive services in a number of our allied countries, there is quite a big debate going on in NATO and in the European Union about how do we reduce the risks of those dependencies being exploited in a period of crisis or war.
Great, thank you. And before we do shift to some audience questions, I did want to come back to you, Heather, and ask you, you touched on some very important issues, I think, on the importance of strengthening the strategic, the U.S. and other nuclear capabilities that at the strategic level that back up NATO's deterrent posture. You mentioned the UK as an option. What about the question of perhaps Europe filling both a combined UK-French effort in filling some of the pressure that the U.S. is going to feel as it continues to focus on deterring China and let's not forget North Korea as well. Sten Running mentioned the interesting comment about, is that part of what was behind Macron's gambit of saying, well, if you put a nuclear-armed power on the ground in Ukraine, is that going to give Putin some second thoughts? And I know you've been thinking about some of these issues with regard to Russia's saber-rattling at CSIS in the Pony Project on deter and divide. So maybe you could, it's a bit of a Merved question, but maybe you could touch on a couple of those issues before we...
I love Merving. So I'll start with the one on the contributions of the UK and France and this debate going on now about a Euro deterrent. I'm not a European. I spend enough time there. I'm a little bit skeptical that Europeans will put aside hundreds of years of history to completely trust one country. One of them, no offense to any of the French in the room, I'm really sorry. But it's not to completely rule it out. I think that Sten's points are really, really well taken. And that just, it highlights how much really is hinging on the upcoming US election. There is one thing about the UK and French arsenals that I do want to highlight, though, and that is the French arsenal has really historically been defined by its ambiguity, which they have really religiously stuck to, whereas the Brits, I think, have tried to strike a slightly different balance in terms of transparency into their arsenal, transparency into numbers, and transparency into their doctrine. And in recent years, in the subsequent integrated reviews that the UK has done, I think we are seeing more of a shift towards ambiguity in the UK's nuclear posture. And I think this is a really fascinating question that NATO itself is also taking up, which is, you know, when it comes to nuclear issues, do we draw red lines? Article 5 is as strong of a red line, really, as you can say. But the nuclear component, I think we're seeing that shift among the allies towards greater strategic ambiguity overall. And then to your question about how to respond to nuclear saber rattling by the Russians, I actually think the alliance has done a pretty good job at this thus far. I saw the Deputy Secretary General recently called it out as psychological intimidation, which I think is a great point, and something that all of us have to kind of sparse out how much of this is rhetoric and how much is reality. And trying to address it that way. And so I think some of the things that the alliance did really well that it should continue to do, first and foremost, is the intelligence sharing component. That was, I thought, really exemplar in the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both within the alliance, but also more publicly, but also calling out and trying to combat Russian disinformation campaigns. And I mean, Russian disinformation is really, it's so pervasive, but in the nuclear space in particular, we're seeing it take on certain flavors. And it's really aggressive. So for example, in October 2022, there was this 6-day period when every single Russian official said, Ukraine is about to use a dirty bomb. And this was clearly a disinformation campaign. Maybe it was an attempt at a false flag. Maybe it was trying to shape a wider narrative. But NATO members came out and pretty clearly and decisively said any nuclear use by Russia will be met with catastrophic consequences. No, Ukraine is not trying to develop a dirty bomb, and really trying to stand up to Russian disinformation in that way. With that said, I think we should anticipate Russian disinformation, you know, it's a multi-headed hydra. It's going to keep evolving. It's going to keep changing. And the purpose of it is to divide the allies. And so staying really on the front foot and forward-leaning on combating that disinformation and combating it across the alliance. I think some allies have taken more of a leadership role in combating disinformation than others, and that's something I think would be great to see more of the allies kind of get involved with. I think that just one other point around this disinformation, but not just disinformation, but Russian nuclear saber rattling, and this gets to the core of what deterrence is, which is we have to convince Russia that using nuclear weapons will not serve its long-term interests, that it will not achieve whatever those desired gains are by using nuclear weapons. And there are a lot of different ways to do that, and that might mean surety of some sort of retaliation response on the part of NATO. But the other idea that I'll put out there has to do with what would be the international reaction. If Russia is the first one to use a nuclear weapon in recent memory, in however many years, then what would the international community do as a response to that? I've had a lot of debates about this recently because I don't know if Putin is facing a decisive military loss, does he care what the international community thinks? The truth is none of us know. If anyone in this room knows what Vladimir Putin is thinking, then please come to the mic and tell us. But I think that is the best way to really stand up to Russian nuclear saber rattling, is having that decisiveness that you will not get what you want by doing this.
Great, thank you. And yeah, and Ambassador Smith mentioned that importance of the information sharing that was going on in terms of what was Russia actually doing when it was rattling that saber was important. But so thank you. All right, we have about 20 minutes for questions from the audience. As you know, you've been directed to go to the microphone if you would and identify yourself. We look forward to some additional questions. I don't see anyone yet rising to the occasion. Oh, good, someone's approaching.
Hi, thank you very much for being here and taking the time. My question is...
Could you tell us who you are? I'm sorry.
My name's Jason Rodriguez.
Yes, Jason.
I'm a PMF in OSD policy currently.
Okay.
So my question is, what lessons from deterrence in Ukraine and on the eastern flank should, or maybe more importantly, should not be applied to deterrence in the case of Taiwan?
Taiwan.
That's an interesting one.
Ready, two at a time? Or are we going?
Should we, okay, we'll take a few and let people cogitate on that one. Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here and taking the time to speak with us. My name is Ellen Harnish. I am a graduate student in the Security Studies program here at Georgetown. I also work in OSD. And my question kind of surrounds this point that's been brought up about political developments and the implications for European security, given what could happen in US politics in the next few months, specifically for Poland. Given the tensions, in Europe, outside of Europe, how feasible do we think it is that France or the UK could extend their nuclear umbrella over Poland, or would it be more prudent for Poland to think about developing its own nuclear weapons? And kind of, if so, when should that start happening? So just curious for your thoughts and opinions on that. Thank you.
Okay, maybe why don't we, so we don't lose the first one, should we, do you want to take that second question, Justyna, and then we'll come back to it?
Maybe we can take another one.
Take one more? Okay, all right, go ahead. All right, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry, we'll take one more.
Hi, I'm Christian Amelia. I'm a recent grad from the SSP program. I had a quick question. Dr. Williams brought up that arms control is, kind of still a pillar of NATO's strategy to some degree, but with the New START treaty set to expire in February of 2026 and Russia and China really having no interest in engaging in arms control, I'm curious what you all think. Should that still be a pillar? And if so, how do you actually operationalize that? Thank you.
Okay. All right, Justyna, you want to start now on Poland and nukes, and then we'll clear capabilities, and we'll come back to.
There is a lot of uncertainty in Poland about the future of U.S. security and defense policy towards Europe and towards the eastern flank. And the situation that you are right now in here in the U.S., the months-long discussions in the Congress on Ukraine supplemental are raising, I would say, this level of uncertainty, because they are showing to us that the domestic situation, domestic politics has a hand over security and defense strategic goals. But I think that overall Poland has a different experience of Trump administration than the rest of Europe, a much more positive one, where Poland has created a workable more bilateral relationship with Trump administration, and has through which Poland has increased U.S. military, economic presence and political ties. We have another government in place which will make a difference, since there is no I would say kind of ideological affinity. So that will be a different situation, but still I think there is some distance from the rest of Europe in discussions in Poland about the immediate repercussions of a change of administration for the eastern flank and for Poland. The discussion about the nuclear deterrent is there in the public, but I think, and is beginning to be also in the Polish administration. Overall, there is a conviction that the U.S. nuclear deterrent is still in place and will remain in place, that we need to do much more in the conventional realm to convince the future U.S. administration, be it Republican or Democrat, that alliances, that the burden sharing in the alliances is much fairer to them, that alliance, NATO, transatlantic partnership is of use and of benefit to the U.S. And I think there is, and therefore from Poland you can hear the proposals of setting the bar for defense spending higher to 3% in the coming years, for making European greater input into regional defense plans, in proposals to strengthen European pillar of NATO, strengthen European engagements as a sort an input, a greater show of European willingness to cooperate and with the future Republican administration. Nuclear discussions for us are difficult because, of course, there are in the public ideas about going nuclear for Poland, but Poland does not have civilian nuclear power plants. Poland, and hence that would be very difficult, and only with the help of a major ally that has nuclear weapons to develop nuclear weapons on its own. That would take time, and in the meantime, Poland would become very vulnerable to some kind of Russian retaliation strikes while developing own nuclear capabilities. With regard to European deterrence or ideas on enhancing European deterrence, I think there is a conversation about the French ideas, but on the margins of acknowledging that the US nuclear deterrent is in place. I suppose that there will be discussions in the future on how to strengthen European component and overall NATO's nuclear deterrence, and that would be the way Poland would like to go.
So if we could turn to I do want to come back to the lessons for Taiwan, but on the question of arms control, and also Heather, maybe that's one other thing we hadn't talked about is as we talk about in the context of Russian nuclear saber rattling and crisis communications, what is lacking now in terms of there not being, there had been some channels established both at NATO and the US in terms of strategic crisis communications with the Russians. Do you think there's some area, some scope for that as well, or finding a way forward on reviving some of those crisis communications capabilities?
Yeah, so Christian, thank you for the question. This is literally my favorite topic. I would have thought I'd planted that question. But you know, should arms control still be part of NATO's position? Absolutely, it should be. However, arms control of the future is going to look very different from arms control of the past. I am not saying that we should be pinning ourselves to something that looks like START or INF or New START. We need to take a more expansive approach to thinking about arms control. Arms control as we know it is dead. It really is. Like New START is kind of the last of its kind. I asked some folks on the PONI team to look at what arms control agreements from the Cold War era are still in place and have not been somehow soiled by Russia. And it's a very short list. It's like, I think I could count it on one hand. And so arms control as we know it, it's really not a thing anymore. And you know, one of those was like the Seabed Treaty. You know, no disrespect to the Seabed Treaty, but that's not exactly the type of arms control that I think we're particularly interested in right now. But with that said, arms control is not just legally binding, verifiable treaties. If we take this more expansive approach, think of arms control as informal agreements, things like the Incidents at Sea Agreement. Which in terms of crisis communication and trying to avoid escalation, that's a really great example of the direction of travel that I think we could be moving in. Other examples might be things that take a more asymmetric approach. You could have joint statements that are focused on controlling behaviors rather than on controlling weapons. Shameless self-promotion. I have an article in Foreign Affairs on this called, I think it's called Behavioral Arms Control. And so it's not about rejecting arms control altogether. It's just about changing what we think arms control looks like and what we want it to achieve. And then just one other point on this. I haven't brought it up yet, but I think it's a really important one. The NPT is also arms control. Mm-hmm. And when we have these conversations about, oh, maybe another NATO ally will develop an independent nuclear weapon, you know, these surveys coming out of South Korea, you know, when we have these conversations, we have to also talk about the NPT. I believe the NPT is pretty weak at the moment, but I also think that we are lucky to have it, and we should do everything we can to preserve and protect it. And so with that said, NATO and NATO's nuclear members in particular have to stay committed to arms control because they will be held accountable in the NPT. And there are a growing number of countries in the NPT that recognize, well, arms control as we know it is dead, so what are you doing for Article 6? And that is literally how those conversations go. And so to maintain the NPT, NATO has to keep this commitment to arms control. And then just final point, another reason I'm pretty skeptical about this idea of new independent nuclear actors like blossoming among America's allies. I mean, is Poland really going to be the first country since North Korea to withdraw from the NPT? I don't think so. I don't think that about South Korea either. And so, but that's also why we need the NPT and we need to keep it healthy. And so arms control might look different, but we still need it, if anything, for that reason.
Okay, and does the person in the back, just give me patience for one last opportunity. I want to pick up, and Angus, I know the defense of Taiwan is not definitely in your responsibility, but obviously we do know, or we certainly, there's a lot of evidence that the PRC is watching carefully the lessons that Russia's learning in Ukraine in terms of resilience, unexpected resilience, the limited capability of some of their cyber and other efforts to disrupt Ukrainian capabilities, space. I wonder if you might touch on maybe some of the, or at least what do you think some of the NATO has lessons have drawn about the war in Ukraine that may also be exportable, let's say.
Well, just very quickly on the other two questions. I mean, I agree with everything Heather said on arms control. And of course, not only would Poland have to withdraw from the NPT, but any ally that helped Poland would have to withdraw from the NPT. So it's a real, that's a real no-go, I think. And on the nuclear deterrence point, I mean, of course, the UK does extend its nuclear deterrence to Poland and to all members of NATO, because the UK's nuclear deterrence is specifically assigned to NATO. It's actually the only one of the P3 that does that in those terms. And I do think that, you know, even if you were to see a changed UK and French posture for the reasons that Heather alluded to earlier, it would almost certainly still be within a broadly NATO framework. That's the only credible framework in which to do that. But what lessons have we learned from Taiwan? Well, I think the most important lesson is don't let conventional deterrence slip in the first place. Because nuclear compellence, i.e. rocking up and saying, do this or I'll nuke you, is really difficult and not very credible. Nuclear deterrence, I've already done this, and if you want to do anything about it, you risk a nuclear response. That's arguably more credible. So don't get yourself in the situation where your opponent has a conventional advantage over you, has achieved something, and is then bringing nuclear deterrence into play to try and stop you doing anything about it. I think that's overwhelmingly the most important lesson. But I think, you know, we would also look at the kind of broader dimensions of deterrence. You know, why did Putin make the mistake of invading Ukraine in the first place? Because his understanding of Ukrainian intent, his understanding of Ukrainian coherence were clearly wrong. We mustn't let Russia, or indeed any other adversary, make the same mistake about us. We have to kind of constantly remind them that our intent, our willingness to fight and defend ourselves, our coherence, they are all absolutely strong. So it's a mixture of conventional deterrence is the basis on which a lot of things rest, and that broader sense of psychological, political coherence and will.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm sorry, the person at the microphone in the back there, I can't quite see you, but.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Jakob Grein. I'm also a graduate student in the Security Studies program. And my question concerns strategic culture. You're very much at the vanguard of European and transatlantic security as experts, as policymakers. Do you see some kind of convergence towards a unified European or NATO strategic culture, or do affairs within NATO continue to be overdetermined by national strategic cultures and individual sort of material and strategic considerations? Thank you.
Right. And I think there's another couple of questions. Why don't we take them together since we're getting close on time?
Hi, my name is Peter Roberto. I work at the Center for European Policy Analysis. I just wanted to ask about those defense and deterrence plans and how NATO and its allies can incorporate other partners like Ukraine or Georgia that are facing Russian forces into those longer-term defense plans in the next 10 to 15 years in the interim to NATO membership.
Okay, and then one last one, please.
Great, thank you. And my thanks to the panel for a very engaging discussion. Question about resilience and to our ASG particularly, but others welcome on this topic. I'm Nathan Rogers, by the way, from Canmore Company, a lot of work in the resilient space, specifically in the transatlantic arena. The question as we approach, of course, the summit, Angus, you mentioned the pledge for civil planning in this regard. Of course, we've taken a lot of steps in the resilience discussion with NATO. Interested in if you can unpack that a little bit more for us, where we're going in the resilience agenda. Of course, we have an original commitment to enhance resilience from the Warsaw Summit 2016. We've had this, the Allies have doubled down on this in 2021. What's in store this year for the resilience, and would you agree resilience is increasingly central to Allied deterrence and defense? Of course, militaries don't just go to war, but nations do. Whole of governments, whole communities responsible for being a part of this. Interested in if you could unpack that for us and where the Alliance is going for resilience. Thank you.
Maybe if we'll start with Angus, if you want to let that question and the one on DDA, perhaps, if you would be willing to address that quickly, and then.
Yeah, so I'll start with the one on culture, because I think that's a really important point. So go back, I think, to the fact that we now have a defense and deterrence, or deterrence and defense strategy that is based on a set of plans that will, over the next few years, give allies a much more granular understanding of exactly what their armed forces are supposed to do. That will drive a level of requirement for interoperability, the ability to fight together both at the granular level and then at the broader kind of strategic level that we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. And I think that is already starting to make or force our allied armed forces to become a bit less nationally focused and a bit more alliance focused. And some of it is kind of basic, some of it's training, but some of it is, for example, equipment. So we have a standard artillery shell in NATO, 155 millimeters. It turns out that over the last 20 years, allies have all gone off and slightly tweaked their artillery and the shells that go in it. So it turns out you can't put a 155 millimeter shell from one ally into the gun of another. And that's happened for all sorts of perfectly understandable reasons, but it's now got to be reversed. And we are now, I think, sort of going back to a much tougher focus on interoperability, standardization. And it's, as I said, it's both technical and it's cultural. On resilience and kind of what next, I mean, we always make the point that resilience is a national responsibility, and some allies would get quite cross with me if I didn't make that point early on. But I think where we're probably going is we've got a cycle now of looking at how allies perform against our resilience baselines. I think over time that cycle will get more demanding, will get more granular in what we're looking at, and we will do more to support allies learning from each other and supporting each other from that. Secondly, I think the broader question of industrial resilience has really come into play over the last 2 years when we've seen how much both North America and Europe has struggled to produce quickly enough what we need, both to support Ukraine and to support our own armed forces. So I think industrial policy, defense industrial policy has become an issue. And then I think the third area I would see really developing is the idea of partnership between the private sector and the public sector when it comes to resilience. That the answer to resilience is not simply to just make your state bigger and bigger and to add more and more functions to it and more capability. The answer is to have properly planned partnerships with the private sector. Transport would be a really good example. The most important single transport actor in European security is probably Deutsche Bahn, the German railway system, which would be absolutely essential to moving things through the center of Europe in a crisis. So it's those kind of partnerships and understandings that we're probably going to have to spend more time on.
Thank you. Well, and just turning to Justyna and Heather, briefly on the question of culture, any thoughts on how the Alliance is doing in maintaining its strategic culture or cohesion?
Yes, thank you. That is a very interesting question. I think that the Alliance have harmonized to a certain extent with regard to Russia and understood Russian goals and Russian way of thinking, but still we see that some divisions in understanding how to react to what Russia is doing against Ukraine are still there. And I would give 2 examples. I think that there is a difference in approaches. There is a difference in approaches on how the West should shape the strategy of military deliveries to Ukraine, and I see a clear division between the eastern flank and Western Europe together with the US, with Western Europe being more cautious, setting red lines that gradually have been crossed but still are maintained, and with Eastern Europe being of the opinion that we should strive to give Ukrainians what we can from the very beginning, and in order for them to push out Russians as quickly as possible. So this fear of escalation that has been existing here in the West is present to a lesser extent in Poland. The fear of domestic consequences of a Russian defeat is here much more present than on the eastern flank. And the understanding that Russia needs to be defeated in order for peace to be maintained in Eastern Europe is strongly on the eastern flank and not that much in Western Europe. So I think still we have different understanding how to deal with Russia and Russian aggression and what should be the end state of the war. So I see the first division between the eastern flank members of the alliance and Western Europe together with the US. And the second division that emerged lately is a very interesting one and shows to me how difficult we will have, how difficult situation we will have in Europe if the US will withdraw. Then we have had exchange of positions and statements between France and Germany on French or Macron's proposal on putting soldiers in Ukraine. France's understanding is if there is less if there is less US in Europe, Europe needs to step in. Right. Germany's understanding is if there is less US in Europe, we need to be very, very careful.
Well, thank you. No, we will have to continue some of this discussion into the break and into the afternoon, but I wanted to give Heather one last chance to make one last comment.
I'll be very quick on, I just want to make a really quick observation on the influence of history on strategic culture, because I think you're asking a really important question. Are we seeing a convergence in strategic culture within NATO? I mean, the answer is yes and no. From a historical perspective, these allies are united by a shared history, by a shared interest in things like democracy and rules-based international order that has carried forward over decades. On the other hand, there is not a convergence, and the allies are not a monolith. And just to end with two kind of personal observations, when I moved to Europe from the US, the most shocking thing to me is the proximity of war. War feels so much closer in Europe. I mean, this was in 2010, 2009, that every British train station has etched in marble the names of the kids from that town who died in a war. That sense that war is so close and that war can happen, and it could be by your neighbor, that feeling doesn't really pervade or sink in the way that it does in the US. And so that influences strategic culture. And then the other very quick observation, it is, the allies are not a monolith. So that was my observation when I moved to Europe. When I moved back here and being in Washington, everyone, including me, says, the allies, the allies, the allies, as if there's only 32 opinions, not to mention the Indo-Pacific. Within each one of the allies, there's probably 100 other opinions. And so I think from the US perspective, we still have a little bit of a historical hang-up on treating the allies as if they are all the same and always speak in one voice. And that affects our strategic culture as well. And so that's something that I really am trying to push, in my own work, is to really have a better understanding of the allies on that much more granular level, because ultimately that will strengthen the alliance itself.
Well, that's a very nice coda to this panel talking about the future of defense and deterrence and why it has to continue to work in the interest of all the members of the transatlantic community and the wider world. So please join me. We're at the break time for lunch. Please join me in thanking our panelists for providing us a very rich intellectual menu.